This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for the 9th report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation series. Slide 2. Today, the authors of our new report on value-added electricity services will present their perspectives. Utilities, third-party providers, and state consumer advocates. They'll have about 45 minutes to present altogether, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Before we get to their presentations, I'll take a few minutes to tell you about the report series and go over webinar logistics. Slide 3. This series of reports is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policymakers, and the electricity industry. The series uses a multiple perspectives format to present different views on the future of utility regulation and business models and the trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds the series, and an advisory group helps prioritize what topics we cover, provides guidance on how we cover them, and reviews the draft reports. Slide 4. Here are the members of our advisory group. They include utilities, utility regulators, state consumer advocates, and other experts, and we thank them for their assistance. Slide 5. We've completed 9 reports so far. Our topic today is value-added electricity services and the new roles that utilities and third-party providers can play. Our next report will address the future of transportation electrification and provide utility, competitive market, and consumer perspectives. Slide 6. Before I turn over the mic for today's presentations, here are a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording a webinar, and we will post it on our website. Because of the large number of participants, everyone is in listen mode only, so please use the chat box to send us your questions and your comments. You can enter your questions at any time. We'll answer as many as we can following the presentations. You may want to direct your question to a specific author. The report authors will each have 15 minutes to present, and then I'll moderate Q&A. The report and webinar series and the slides for this webinar today are posted at the website shown. Following the webinar, we'll post a recording. Slide 7. Here are our presenters today. Jonathan Blanchfield is the Senior Manager of Strategic Alliances for the Institute for Electric Innovation. Earlier, he worked at the U.S. Department of Energy, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Solar Energy Industries Association, and at a private energy regulatory law firm. Ryan Kodowski is Vice President of Industry Analysis at Advanced Energy Economy. He oversees the organization's regulatory work and helps lead its 21st Century Electricity System Initiative. Earlier, he spent 20 years as an energy consultant. And Robert Mork chairs the Electricity Committee of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. He led a subcommittee of interested members to draft the organization's perspective for this report. Rob has served at the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counsel since 2000 and Deputy Consumer Counsel for Federal Affairs. He also serves as president of the Consumer Advocates of PG&E States and is on the MISO Advisory Committee. Slide 8. I asked each of these authors to cover 4 questions that address new value-added services that grid modernization enables and appropriate roles for utilities versus third-party providers, policy and regulatory challenges that may be needed in the face of increasing competition for electricity services from third-party providers, ways regulators might address utility costs for new value-added services, and policy and regulatory approaches to balance innovation and consumer protection. Slide 9. Following presentations, we'll respond to questions you post in the chat box. Please enter your questions at any time. Let's begin our presentation. John?
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to everyone on the webinar about the electric utilities' role in providing value-added electricity services. Before I begin the substance of my presentation, I'll just give everyone an overview of the Institute for Electric Innovation and our focus. So the Institute for Electric Innovation is the foundation arm of the Edison Electric Institute. We are an organization that represents both electric companies and technology companies. So primarily we have primarily my job is to work with technology companies and establish relationships between the members of our technology partner roundtable, as you see here, and our member electric utilities, which are all of the investor-owned utilities in the United States. So we do this through publications, thought leadership, and in-person roundtable dialogues. So this paper focuses a lot on grid modernization and the energy services that are enabled by grid modernization initiatives that are underway across the United States. So these efforts are yielding benefits to both the customer and the energy grid, and as such, the line between what are traditional energy services and, quote, value-added energy services is becoming a little bit fuzzy. And you'll see this in the report. The authors take different positions on what constitutes a value-added service. So while the report indicates, the introduction to the report indicates a number of value-added services that we've all agreed are value-added services, some electric utilities consider those just plain old energy services, particularly going forward as they continue to modernize their grid. So it's just important to keep in mind that that distinction exists. I will begin by giving our high-level overview of why we believe electric companies should be able to provide value-added electricity services. And I'll give a couple of illustrations of how that's playing out in various jurisdictions today. I'll follow that by talking a little bit about some regulatory changes that we believe would facilitate a value-added services marketplace going forward. And then I will also give some examples of how that might play out in real time, in the real world. So primarily, we have 4 primary reasons why we believe electric companies should have the option to participate in providing value-added services. So, and let me just say at the outset that we believe that word option is critical. So these value-added services are being provided by electric companies today, and it's being done in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's through outright ownership of an asset, either at the distribution level or on a customer's premises. Sometimes these value-added electricity services are being provided directly by third parties to consumers, and sometimes it's being provided in partnership to consumers by a partnership between technology companies and the utilities working together. So we think that there's a place for all of those arrangements, but what's critical to us is that electric companies not be excluded from providing these value-added services if they would like to participate in a market for the services themselves. So that's critical. So at the outset, there are a couple reasons. Before I go into the 4 primary reasons, it's just important to recognize that electric companies have the ability, the willingness, and historical mandate to serve all customers, regardless of income, geographic location, or type of customer. And this sets electric companies apart from third-party providers that don't have an obligation to serve. And so going forward, we acknowledge that rules and regulations can be put in place to help facilitate the establishment of a marketplace that is equitable and fair to all players, and that it's important that all players are competing on a level playing field. We believe that this is possible to accomplish. So for us, the first reason that electric companies should be allowed to provide these services is that they are well positioned to grow the market for value-added services. And a great example of this is the electric vehicle charging infrastructure market in California. So initially, the California PUC in 2011 imposed a blanket prohibition on utility-owned EV charging infrastructure. There was an exception for fleet charging, utility fleet charging, But in 2014, the PUC generally overturned this blanket prohibition and allowed them to enter the marketplace because the market was not evolving sufficiently to meet state policy objectives, specifically certain number of EVs on the road and GHG reduction targets. So that's a very clear example of the electric company's role in growing the market for a specific service. The second reason is that electric companies will expand customer access to value-added services. So as I mentioned earlier, electric companies are mandated to serve all customers. This is both a legal and a social responsibility that electric companies take very seriously. Some third-party providers ignore certain segments of customer populations, specifically low-income customers or customers with low credit scores. So electric companies are well-positioned to serve customers who might have a low credit score but who are otherwise in good standing with their electric company. This is really important to consider, especially given that a lot of customers in certain jurisdictions are actually low income. I think we've seen numbers upwards in the 40% range. So that we need to be cognizant of that particular piece of the equation. The third reason is that electric companies can build visibility into the energy grid and extract the most value from value-added services. So electric company ownership or partnership with other technology companies can facilitate the optimization of these services through better resource location and integration. And we can work with customers to target resources for specific locations on the energy grid to provide additional benefits to both customers and the energy grid. So visibility and insight into the operation and behavior of these resources is critical. And if we're excluded from the marketplace, there's no way that we can have that visibility or that ability to interact with those assets to extract grid optimization benefits. And then the fourth reason is that electric company participation yields more competition and lowers costs to customers. So fundamentally, the more participants in a marketplace, or a market rather, the more competition, and then generally costs will be lowered. And customers generally benefit from open and transparent competition. Again, provided that proper rules and regulations are in place. Competitive pressure from multiple market participants can put downward pressure on costs, broaden customer access to the market, and spur innovation in developing new products and services. A great example of this is the cost decline of solar resources in the United States. Electric company participation in that market, whether through partnership with technology companies or direct provision of those resources themselves, has resulted in tremendous decreases in cost, which continues today. So to accomplish a robust value-added services market and to extract the most value from these services, to yield the most benefits to customers and the energy grid, we take the position that it's important to categorize these value-added services. And there's two categories in our minds. So services primarily meeting customer needs and services primarily meeting energy grid needs. And there are certain value-added services like battery storage that can meet both customer needs and grid needs. And in those hybrid situations, I think we can craft some rules and regulations that will take care of it. But primarily what we say is for those value-added services that are benefiting specific customers, those customers should be responsible for paying for those services. But in some cases, when the value-added service is benefiting the energy grid, those costs should be socialized. Again, how to accomplish this? Sending accurate and transparent price signals is a necessary condition for a robust and competitive value-added services market. So today in the United States, the energy grid is primarily funded through volumetric charges, and this is a really inefficient way to accomplish the needs, or to provide the needs of a modernized grid, and to continue to invest in modernizing the grid. So for us, it's really critical that we separate the costs of the commodity electricity from the costs of the energy grid, which are together separate from the cost of value-added services. And this largely comes down to competitive versus non-competitive markets. So the distribution grid is owned and operated by electric companies, and it is non-competitive. Those costs should continue to be socialized as they are today. All customers, regardless of whether they're solar customers or storage customers or plain vanilla basic service customers, utilize and benefit from the energy grid, and so they should have a role in paying for that or for those services. Commodity electricity is competitive in some places and non-competitive in other places, and that will be state-specific going forward. But again, paying for the electricity is paying for the energy costs or the capacity costs, or however your state is structured, is very different than paying for grid services. And then also, it's different from paying for competitive services. And if you want battery storage in your garage, or if you would like solar on your roof, that customer should generally pay for the cost associated, or pay for the cost of that service. When you get into interconnection costs, the question becomes a little bit more complex, but again, we propose that rules and regulations can be put in place in order to ensure that that the marketplace is equitable. So I've covered a couple of these examples. There are a couple more examples of how this is playing out in the United States today. So I talked a little bit about California, the history there. Rooftop solar in Arizona is another example of how electric company participation has really broadened access to a large segment of customers in that state that would otherwise not have been served or have access to that service had electric companies not been allowed to participate. And then energy storage in Oregon, Massachusetts, and California is another example how state PUCs are really recognizing that electric companies have a critical role to play in providing these services and getting them in the hands of customers. Oregon in particularly is interesting because they came out with a mandate, 200 megawatt hour, a 5 megawatt hour storage procurement mandate for Portland General and Pacificor, but they left it up to the electric company to determine what ownership model would be best for them, and then they have the burden of sort of proving that to the PUC. So I think that's a great illustration of how a PUC recognizes that electric companies need flexibility in order to deploy these resources, and a PUC sort of responding to that flexible need. And then finally, energy efficiency. It's probably the best known value-added service. It's a little bit different because it is legislatively mandated, but I think in a lot of states, not all states of course, but I think the important part here for energy efficiency is that while it is subsidized and mandated, all customers generally benefit from electric company provision of this service. So it generally lowers the cost for all customers. And that scale and scope is really only achieved through electric company provision. And again, that's done either directly through the utility or in partnership with third-party providers. So in conclusion, electric companies have a critical role to play in providing these services, especially as the market for them continues to evolve. And in defining the rules and regulations governing the participation of electric companies and third-party providers, we've got to make sure that our guiding star, our North Star, is the customer. What is best for the customer? What will lower costs for the customer? What will yield the most benefits to the customer? And generally, electric company participation is a mechanism to achieve those benefits. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as a reminder to those listening to the webinar, please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter them at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can following the presentation. If you want to direct your question to a specific author, please feel free to do so. Ryan?
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to provide the third-party provider's perspective on this question of value-added services. And I think you'll hear some interesting similarities with what Jonathan just provided and some interesting differences as well. And I'll just go through that in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So just to provide a high-level summary of the position of third-party providers, we view this as a fairly complex and nuanced issue that should be tailored to the needs of each jurisdiction. We do believe that both utilities and third parties have critical roles to play in providing value-added services. Our primary concern is ensuring that we don't have regulated utilities in direct competition with third-party providers in providing the same value-added services to the same customers. And I think that's an important sort of specific point about this issue. We believe that competitive services that can be competitive should be, and that competition over the long term is what's going to drive value for the customer and bring down costs. Our concern arises out of the monopoly position of the utility and our concern about being able to create a true level playing field across all stakeholders and for all services. With that said, we do see a key role for the utility in creating a platform upon which these value-added services could be provided, but we also do see a very important role for them to provide those services directly where that's appropriate. We also see this role in a larger context of the changes we see taking place in the electricity sector, and we would like to see utility incentives and regulations evolve to support the collaboration, innovation, and market animation that I think we all want. So I'll dive into each of these in a little bit more detail. I'll touch briefly on this. We try to capture sort of the broad nature of the state of play in the electricity sector with this slide. Hopefully this is familiar to a lot of you. I think the big takeaway from this is that we ask a lot from our electricity grid, and we're going to be asking more from it in the future. And that creates both challenges and opportunities. And I think value-added services is a great example of one of the opportunities that is coming out of the changes we see in the investments that utilities are making to modernize the grid and in third-party providers in developing value-added services. So I'll give you very quickly our definition of basic and value-added services. We define basic services as those provided by the regulated utility as it carries out its monopoly function. So these are provided to all customers with the costs associated with those services collected from all customers. We actually include energy efficiency in this category. We view that as a basic service of the utility. I think Jonathan mentioned they're often provided through a regulatory or legislative mandate, and we actually roll that into the basic service portfolio of the utility. We also think of some basic services as being provided from the utility to those third-party providers as part of that utility role in animating the market. An example here could be making AMI data, advanced metering infrastructure data, available to customers and their designated third parties. I suppose that you could define value-added services as everything else, but I think it's helpful to think through that in a little bit more detail. These are optional enhanced services that are provided either by the utility or by the competitive market. Customers would choose to receive this service in addition to their basic service, and they would generally pay separately for those services. I think there are some important exceptions to that, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. Some of these value-added services may arise because they actually are a monopoly function of the utility, a monopoly service, others provided by the competitive market. And just like with basic services, we see the opportunity for utilities to offer value-added services to third parties as well. And just following up on that example of advanced metering infrastructure data, which the provision of which would be classified as a basic service, it's possible that the utility could provide some enhanced data services or data analysis using that data and then sell that as a value-added service to a third party. So with that basic definition in mind, let's talk a little bit more about the roles we see for utilities and third-party companies. I think the key issue for us comes down to this issue of competition on a level playing field for those value-added services. Our concern is mitigating some of the inherent advantages that a utility would have and the ability to create that level playing field. With that said, we do see that important role for utilities, and we want them to be rewarded for filling that role. Some people refer to the utility evolving as a platform upon which transactions can occur. We think that model is something that's going to continue to be implemented. It'll take different forms in different jurisdictions. A key differentiator obviously will be whether a state is vertically integrated or restructured. We generally view that services based on technology that's deployed on the customer side of the meter should be the realm of the competitive market. Again, we do see some exceptions. I think the example of energy efficiency, where there's a strong partnership between a utility and third-party providers, is a great example that you can take to the value-added services market. So it does not mean that utilities don't get to engage in revenue-producing activities associated with services on customer premises, but that generally that's where competitive providers operate today and where they should continue to operate. Important part of our view on this is that utilities can have unregulated affiliates, and we fundamentally don't see them as being treated any differently from any other third party, subject to codes of conduct that govern their interaction between themselves and the parent company, the regulated company. So that's obviously a way that any utility can engage in the full spectrum of value-added services, regardless of how you define the marketplace. So we've developed some general criteria that we think should guide decisions by state commissions on when a utility should be able to directly provide a value-added service to a customer. Again, these are guidelines. We see this taking different forms in different jurisdictions. But if I'll just run through these real quick. Obviously, if there's a service that's enabled by the utility's monopoly position and it's classified as a value-added service, services to third parties to support the animation of the market, services that address underserved segments. I think Jonathan gave the example of solar to low-income customers. We would agree that that's actually an area where we think direct utility involvement would make sense. We would like to see that involvement target removal of barriers that is inhibiting a fully competitive market from developing. And then the fourth area would be demonstration of new technologies and business arrangements. As we go down this path of utility of the future, 21st century electricity grid, it goes by many names, we're going to need to test out lots of new ideas, new technologies, but more importantly, new business arrangements. And we think this is an area where more direct involvement, at least initially by utilities, to prove out new business models makes a lot of sense. I'll give 4 examples of cases where we think utility provision of value-added services makes sense. I already gave the low-income solar example. Also talked about provision of customized AMI data as a market animation mechanism. Provision of renewable energy tariffs in a vertically integrated market. We know of lots of companies that have sustainability goals and are trying to get more access to renewables to run their operations, and this is a great example of where a utility can offer that as a value-added service to those customers. We also think that EV charging infrastructure and charging services is an area where direct utility involvement is important. There's a very significant benefit, not just to the customers who would use those charging services, but to customers as a whole and to society at large. And there's currently a lack of competitive options, and there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue here, where we need the infrastructure to be built out so that more cars will get on the road and so on. And we see an important role for utilities in helping to create that marketplace. As I said at the beginning, we actually view this in a larger context. You can't really look at value-added services in isolation. They're part of a much bigger picture of the changes that are taking place. So for our perspective on how those value-added services should play out, they need to be seen in the context of some of these other changes. So we list a number of changes here that basically, create a shift in utility financial incentives so that they have greater flexibility in terms of revenue and earnings opportunities and how they engage in the marketplace. Some of these are in place in a number of states already. Others are more speculative or forward-looking. All of these are designed to encourage utilities to collaborate with third parties as opposed to compete directly against them in their core businesses. Lastly, on the subject of paying for value-added services, we also believe that in general, value-added services should be paid for by the customers who use them. There are some important exceptions to that. The example of EV charging is one. When a utility is providing a value-added service, just like it provides other service, we think that there should be a cost basis for that with a regulated rate of return. And importantly, if the utility is using certain assets that it already uses to provide basic service, and if that enables a value-added service to be offered, the pricing for that value-added service should reflect those costs of the basics of the regulated resource. So, if there's an example, if a utility deploys battery storage at a substation to help meet its basic service requirements, and it can now offer a value-added service using that battery, essentially there should be an allocation of those regulated resource costs into that value-added service. And the goal is to have the customer who's benefiting from that service pay for it, and then return some of those costs to ratepayers that paid for that initial investment. Finally, we were asked the question about promoting innovation and protecting consumers. Our view is that strong competition is the best way for regulators to ensure innovation and drive down costs. With that said, obviously it's very important that customers have confidence in the marketplace. They're going to be engaging with their energy use in new ways. They're going to be engaging with other companies beyond the utility in new ways, and they have to have confidence in that marketplace. When we look at that issue, we see lots of existing local, state, and federal consumer protections. These govern how these third parties interact with their customers. It's not necessarily just a utility or energy specific issue. We do recognize that utility commissions will have an interest in ensuring that confidence and those consumer protections. So we do see a role for them to take action where necessary. We do caution, however, that what we don't want is regulators taking too strong of a hand at the beginning in the risk that might stifle innovation and impede the progress of the development of the very markets they're looking to create. So we do see an important role for regulators, but want them to take actions where there are clearly identified problems, as opposed to imposing broad market rules that may slow the development of the marketplace. I think with that, I will turn it back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Ryan. Just a reminder for those listening, please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter those questions and comments at any time. We have one more presentation coming up, and following that, we'll get into questions with the authors. If you'd like to direct your question to a specific author, please feel free to do that. So our last presentation is by Rob with Sukkah. Rob?
Thank you very much, Lisa. Glad to be here with Jonathan and Ryan today. I am Robert Mork with the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, but more to the point today, I am here as the chair of the Sukkah Electric Committee. And I wanted to go through a little bit of background about how we arrived at the remarks that we've shared in our part of this paper and this presentation. It's a little bit different maybe than some of the other contributors. So NSUCA is an association of 44 consumer advocates in 40 states in the District of Columbia. And importantly, our members are designated by the laws of their respective jurisdictions to represent the interests of utility consumers before state and federal regulators in the courts. We like to point this out because I think that this imbues our organization with maybe a little bit broader share of the public interest sometimes than some of the other stakeholders that we have in these kinds of discussions. And I think it's important to kind of bear that into account. This goes into a little more detail about how some of us are set up, but I'll just say we're excited to participate. Many of our offices feel very passionately about these issues, and I'd like to suggest up front to invite you to work with us as you're working on these issues up front, as opposed to sometimes we feel, maybe everybody feels this way, but sometimes we feel that folks come to us last after they've gotten everybody else to sort of go along with what they're thinking. And it's helpful to have discussions up front to sort of build relationships with us and help us through what you're thinking. So an overview of our process. We took the initial 4 questions. We sent them around to all the NSUCA member offices so that we could get contributions from the widest possible sense of what our members think about this. So we had a series of 5 calls that were open to, again, all of our members in NSUCA. I want to emphasize again that there's a wide range of view among our different offices. So this paper shouldn't really be seen as kind of a consensus document necessarily on what NSUCA feels. It's more of a reflection of kind of the range of views from amongst our membership. So I know all these sorts of presentations contain some degree of disclaimer that that this doesn't necessarily represent the feelings of all members, but I think it's worth noting it and emphasizing it particularly here. We do have contributions from states as part of this effort that kind of span the geographical breadth and width of the United States, also from different kinds of states. Some are more restructured, some are more traditionally regulated. So it's hopefully, it may have been a little bit of a challenge for us to write because it does reflect a wide variety of opinions, but hopefully it gives you a sense of what our members care about. So I guess this finishes off our disclaimer. Again, not the views of any particularly state or office, or especially my office in Indiana. I also want to emphasize this as kind of the general, I'll call it a mission here of consumer advocates, that I'm sure this language will probably resonate with many of you, that we want to ensure the continuation of safe, affordable, and reliable electricity. That's kind of the standard way of thinking about utilities in the past, but also looking more towards kind of some of the market issues here, that consumers are protected as well as empowered and well informed, and that appropriate valuation, transparency, and disclosures exist. So, value-added services. There's lots of intriguing opportunities here that can be accomplished through some of these services. But we want to emphasize again, and this is in keeping with what I said earlier about us representing a broad slice of the public interest, that customers' needs and wants really do vary. And our job as consumer advocates is to be sure that the little guy who, doesn't always get the full attention of everyone in the room. Certainly, sometimes there's, to be frank, less money to be made off him. Some of these people really do just want basic, cheapest service and kind of look at things in terms of, I'm turning on the same light switch I've switched on for years, and why is it more expensive, and why do I have to do complicated things? So we want to be sure that those perspectives are included, as well as the perspectives of those who may be, excited about some of these new kinds of services. Let's see. So let me move on. Okay, so value-added services, what does it mean? I think the other two speakers have talked about this. Again, they're customer-side ones, grid-sized ones. And again, we're kind of, we see ourselves in this process as something of the voice of caution. Yes, we'd like these services. There are opportunities here, but we want to make sure that it's all thought through, and especially that those who benefit should bear the costs. So question one, we see pros and cons to utilities being involved in these new services. I think probably many of you feel that there's some valid points on both sides, and our members have strong feelings on both sides. That there are affiliate transaction concerns, there are code of conduct issues, there are opportunities that can be met sometimes best by incumbent utilities, and we heard a little bit about this from Ryan, I think a few minutes ago, who conceded that there are situations where you need kind of a first mover who can get some of these programs going, or who can help reach low-income customers. So there are trade-offs that we feel here on both sides. Question two. Consumer protection and education are part of the meat and potatoes of what we do here. We need accountability. Individual personal data needs to be protected. We have our members have a lot of experience, especially in some of the retail choice states, also in some of the states that are seeing a lot of solar penetration, about sometimes customers being aggressively marketed to, sometimes door-to-door sorts of situations where customers don't understand what they're signing up for. Sometimes the savings don't end up being what the customers thought they were being promised. There are a range of issues here that we think it's important to be sensitive to and make sure that are adequately covered by the regulatory process. Also, potential inequities, a lack of a level playing field, if you will, between utilities and third-party providers. Question three. Costs. There seems to be agreement amongst us speakers that the costs should be borne by the customers of value-added services. I know there's some nuances there, and we may get into some of those in the question and answer sessions. It seems clear that there's a role for regulators here to try to delve into what costs really should be incurred by the basic electric service customers, and where some of those costs should be passed along and attached to value-added services. If you want to look more at our section of the report, there is a long list of potential costs, and we try to break those down in some more detail. One part of the cost issue, though, that we wanted to raise that isn't always addressed as much by economic regulators is the kind of practical quality of life cost. This quote resonated with us, that life is short and people are busy. Personally, at home, I've got 3 kids. My wife and I both work full-time, demanding professional jobs. I'm sure I'm not alone in this. And for many of us, life is good in part because there are a series of desirable default rules in place, which ensure that even if we do nothing at all, things will go along fine. And so choices can be empowering. That can be a great thing, but sometimes it's great to be able to go about our business without having to worry about all the details. So we wanted to bring this out as part of the discussion as well. Question 4, policy and regulatory approaches. I think that you will find a wide variety of opinions in our group about some of the issues which were raised by Ryan and Jonathan. Customer charges, some of these issues, there's a lot of heat amongst our memberships on. High customer charges are not popular amongst most of our membership. Decoupling is something that there's a range of opinion on, performance-based rate making, incentives for capital expenditures versus operating expenditures. There's some interesting possibilities there. The idea of platforms versus utilities themselves competing, shared savings. For many of us, I think it boils down to the devil being in the details on these. And I would encourage you, to the extent you want to expand any of these sorts of approaches, to talk early and often with us if you'd like to get us to buy in and come along with you on some of these types of regulatory innovations. So some key takeaways. I don't want to go through these in a lot of detail because I know our time is running short, but we want to emphasize always what benefits the consumer, provides maximum benefit to the public. That's deeply in our DNA. Let me just skip through some of these just a little bit. Again, on opposing utilities offering new services, come talk with us. I think it's always constructive to engage with us in the early stages of these discussions instead of coming to us with something that you want us to sign on to when the package is already wrapped up with a big pretty bow on top. Seems like there's, let's move on to the last page here. The role of the states here is very important to us in deciding what entity is best positioned to offer value-added services and ensure appropriate consumer protections. I think, that, again, that's very deeply in our DNA, as well as the costs and values, making sure that there's cost-benefit type analysis. We also want to make sure that regulators have the ability to sort through how to decide where the costs of value-added services, what the costs are, and who should be paying for them. Accountability is big. There need to be assurances that the product offered actually provides promised benefits, and it sounds easy to have a neutral, open, non-discriminatory platform, but as we all know, there's a lot of complexity involved in this, and we're happy to be involved in helping sort through the details. Again, personal data is an extremely important part of the equation also to many customers who we don't always hear from quite as much. So I think that is the highlights of our contribution to the report. Thanks again, and please reach out to us after this call and as you go forward and working on these issues, and I look forward to the discussion and question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. So it's not too late if you want to get some additional questions into the chat box. Please go ahead and type those in. But we'll get started with some questions for our presenters. So we've got a lot of questions in the door. Let me just start with this one. Does an electric company participation in value-added services amount to an expansion of the franchise? Jonathan, do you want to give that a shot? Sure.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a really fundamental question. We don't agree that, or let's just say that our answer to that question is no. So again, it sort of largely comes down to pricing. How are you paying for these services, and who's benefiting from them? So certainly there are functions of the utility that will continue to be non-competitive, like, as I mentioned, distribution grid services. Electric companies largely own and maintain and operate the distribution grid, and we foresee that to be the case well into the future. But I think it's important that we're not bringing the assumption underlying that question to the table. So I think the assumption is that electric companies, the term electric company or utility equals non-competitive. And I think that's important to sort of debunk. So we do compete with third-party providers and technology companies today. We acknowledge that there's got to be a level playing field. But really, when we start talking about leveraging the scale and scope of our companies to bring benefits to customers, that's not necessarily anti-competitive. Companies outside of this sector leverage their scale and scope to bring costs down and to yield other sorts of benefits all the time. So I think those are two important distinctions that I would highlight to answer that question.
Thanks. And Ryan, did you want to respond to that as well?
Sure. The way I see it is, as long as you have roles that are well defined, I think it's fine for the utility to, I don't know if I call it expanding the franchise, but sort of to expand the scope of services that it has to offer. The thing that we want to ensure is that we really do have a true level playing field for the provision of those value-added services. And what sets utilities apart from other companies that bring scale and scope to lowering costs is their unique position as that franchise provider. So I think it's going to be up to regulators to decide what that right balance is between leveraging that scale and scope of the utility to provide what we term basic services, and also using that same scale and scope to provide the value-added services that may be in direct competition with companies that don't have that same status.
So let's move on to another question here. One of the webinar participants said there's been no mention of risk in the webinar. Certainly we talked about that in the report. So I'll just read the question that came in. Why must captive ratepayers and not shareholders bear the risk when a utility steps into offerings beyond the provision of safe, adequate, and reliable service? If a utility's venture fails, ratepayers are left paying. I think probably everyone will want to get in on this. Let's start with John.
Sure. Thank you. I think that it's important, again, so let's just say, so some electric companies are moving into this space, are saying a certain segment of our customers want these services. We're going to provide them regardless of whether we have upfront regulatory approval, and we're going to move forward and do that, and with the faith that our regulators will be behind us once they see the value that we're bringing to the table. So there are companies that are moving ahead and taking the risk on themselves, or their shareholders are taking on the risk themselves. It's also important to recognize that our companies are very, I think we're very much in line with Sukkah and state consumer advocates offices, where we do want to move at the pace of value or at the pace of customer. We don't want to have stranded assets. We don't want to have obsolete technology out there on the grid or in customers' homes. There's no value for us in that, and there's no value for them in that. So we want to be prudent. We want to remain being prudent, but we also need to recognize that these services are evolving, and more and more customers are wanting them. So I think if we're doing our job appropriately and identifying the right technologies and targeting the right capabilities, then I think we can avoid that issue of technology obsolescence, or we can mitigate that risk to an acceptable degree.
Rob, do you want to get in here on the question about risk? to ratepayers?
Sure, I'll go. It's risk seems to be one of the great issues of our time in the utility industry. With uncertainties about environmental futures and all kinds of things. It's obviously important to us that it be allocated appropriately. I mean, it seems like there are those things that we think of as basic services are the province of the utility, and the regulated sort of services of the utility, and that once you get beyond those, we should be looking at those who are going to benefit. I think that the shareholders in making money off the service and perhaps to some limited degree that's carefully thought through by the commissions with the input of all the parties, those customers who benefit from that kind of service. Sometimes there's some costs that go along with that, but there needs to be a protection of basic services from that.
Great. Ryan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll just chime in briefly. Obviously, competitive providers take that risk all the time. It's they live and die by the success of their products and service offerings. And certainly a utility through an unregulated affiliate can participate in that same space. I would agree with Jonathan that we certainly don't want to see stranded assets. We think the grid is going to be changing a lot in the coming years, and we want to make sure that transition and that evolution happens in a way that we don't see lots of stranded assets, and that utilities should absolutely get paid, for the services they provide, for the investments they make, and so on. I think if regulators take a careful approach to sort of weighing that, what are the right services, value-added services for utilities to be offering under what circumstances, and they can help mitigate that risk. And I take a very quick, simple example of a utility that wants to offer a renewable energy tariff. They're going to offer that to specific customers. Those specific customers are going to be the ones to pay for that. And let's say, for argument's sake, that the cost of that electricity is a little bit more expensive than system power, or the utility has to go out and build that generation so that it can meet those customers' needs. If that demand doesn't materialize, then the question becomes who bears that risk. And I think that sort of without having all the answers, I think what that example illustrates is the need to consider these carefully and move forward carefully in such a way that risk to the customers who are just receiving basic service is not too great.
Thanks. Ryan, I'm going to stick with you for another question here. So the question says that you point out regulators should not stifle innovation up front. And so, that's one of Advanced Energy Economy's arguments, I believe, for limiting utilities' involvement. But then you also propose that utilities wanting to offer value-added services should, if it's approved by the regulator, should have a regulated rate of return on those services. Maybe it's because they're a first mover here. So how do you see these things complementing each other versus contradicting each other? On the one hand, not wanting to stifle innovation, and then trying to limit their involvement, but hey, if the utilities do have value-added services, then they should have a regulated rate of return on them. And it's a little bit of a complex question.
It's a little bit of a complex question. I think at the end of the day, if a regulated entity is providing a service, then that service should be cost-based. And if you in competitive markets, prices form in a different manner. The competitive providers of that service, whether it's a third party or a utility affiliate, they're going to be continuously looking at ways that they can innovate and drive down costs and compete with each other. That's one realm. And then I think within the framework that we've laid out, there's a separate set of services for which the utility providing them either directly to customers or to third parties, and the services that fall into that category, they're of a different nature, so they're subject to different, they're not really price formation rules, but they're going to be subject, or they should be subject to different approaches for determining what the appropriate fees the utilities should be charging for those services.
Jonathan, anything you want to add to that?
It was a difficult question to parse, but no, I agree that we need to, for fear of muddying the waters, I'm actually going to say no. I'm good. Let's move on.
And this is Rob. I'm happy to muddy the waters on this. There are times, I think, when risk, when sometimes the most efficient way of allocating risk is with the help of a regulated utility. I mean, there are some things where it's probably efficient to do that, but we want to be careful about being in situations where the utility feels like it can rely on ratepayers too much to backstop the risk. So I think we always want to have the utility to feel like it has some skin in the game, and to always have an open, transparent process where the risks and rewards are thought through, and where regulators are able to have a final say on how best to address the risk of some of these new kinds of services, or whether it should be left as something that the competitive market can come in and take care of.
All right, I'm going to insert a comment here from one of our advisory group members, Jay Morrison, from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. I think in response to my reading, just a question that came in, and perhaps some viewpoints also expressed by some of the authors. He says, it is a mistake to say that value-added services go beyond safe, reliable, affordable service, or that they go beyond the franchise. Most of the services we're talking about have been a part of the portfolio of resources that the utility offers to ensure safe, reliable, affordable service. And as technology and communications improve, they will become more and more so. And he says the utility is in the ideal position to build an optimal portfolio with all of these things, large-scale, distributed resources. All consumers could be better off and have safer, more reliable, and more affordable power if the new technology and services are integrated into the portfolio. Okay, so thanks, Jay, for that comment. I'm going to go to another question here. If the value-added services that the utility offers lower overall system costs, should utilities be able to pursue those investments with rate of return? In other words, if demand-side resources reduce the needed investment in generation or transmission and distribution by more than their cost, should the utilities actually be incentivized to pursue those solutions?
And it sounded like Doug meant that for me. So this is Rob. Maybe I'll take a shot at that. I guess your particular jurisdictions, what they choose to do might vary, but one of the papers talked about how sometimes energy efficiency is the least cost resource, and including that as part of the overall utilities approach makes sense. I think that may sometimes it may make sense to have that as part of the basic electric services, but I don't know that all of our members would necessarily agree with that.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. Sorry, this is Jonathan.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Ryan. I would agree with Doug that when resources are lowering costs for all customers, that there's an obvious argument for those to be included in the rate base. But I think going forward, we see this in New York happening, and we see this in California. Largely, these sort of distributed assets are coming in, they're penciling out at least cost. So they're going to be part of the utilities portfolio going forward. But I think in the future there'll be a variety of ownership models within a single jurisdiction that constitute sort of that constitutes extraction of the most value both for the customer and the energy grid. So in some cases, putting these assets in the rate base will make a lot of sense, and in some cases, these assets being left to the competitive marketplace makes more sense. I think we're going to see a mix in the future, but when the costs are being lowered for the overall system, I think the argument for putting that in the rate base is very clear.
And Ryan, did you want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, just briefly. I actually agree with pretty much most of what was just said. I guess it boils down to sort of the ways in which the utilities ultimately pursue those resources. And I think, yes, in some cases it might make sense to think of those as basic services and put them into the rate base, so to speak, although it might not be a question of putting hard assets into the rate base, and maybe it's a new way for utilities to procure services from this technology, and take a look at rate making and see how those services, how utilities can profit from pursuing those services if those services are readily provided through the competitive market and lower cost. So I actually do think we will see a variety of approaches to this. It's going to depend on what types of resources they are, what the market for those resources looks like, where they're located, and so on. But I also see an opportunity for a range of models here where some of those, I guess, putting in the rate base implies a degree of socializing those costs. And yes, I think there's opportunities to socialize costs in some cases, and in others to have individual customers cover those costs depending on what's being offered.
All right, let's move on. Here's a question about using an analogy of energy efficiency programming. So many states have applied standard benefit cost tests to determine what efficiency measures and programs should be included in a utility's portfolio. So do the presenters think that the same or perhaps a similar set of standard practice tests should be applied to other value-added services that we're discussing here today? And do you have any thoughts on how those tests might be applied, or whether they'd be quite different? Who would like to go first? How about Ryan?
I was gonna say, if none of us want to go first, I'm not sure what that says. But so we actually define that energy efficiency example as a basic service, and then I think it makes a lot of sense to apply a robust benefit cost analysis to those programs. When you're talking about value-added services to individual customers, where the primary beneficiary of that is the customer, I'm not sure that I haven't really thought through this very carefully, but I'm not sure that it's the same kind of benefit cost analysis is necessary, because it's a question of whether or not that individual customer chooses to buy the service. I think all the presenters have covered to some degree the situation where there is a rationale for socializing costs for value-added services. And I think Jonathan and I both gave the example of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I think when you're talking about a fairly focused and I'll call it deliberate desire of the utility to engage in that kind of thing, then it probably does warrant some more careful consideration of benefits and costs.
Jonathan or Rob?
Yeah, this is Rob. I'll jump in on the electric vehicle charging and whether that sort of thing should be included in value-added services. I think one of the caveats to that in one of the papers was it should sort of depend on whether there are public policy goals being pursued by the state to pursue some of the attributes that are associated with those kinds of additions to the grid. And I think in that kind of situation it makes sense. Otherwise, I think some of our members would be a little more skeptical.
Okay, here's a question about sort of quality assurance and quality control for these new value-added services that are offered to consumers. And I think this question should apply whether the utility is offering this value-added service or whether it's a third party. The question is, who is going to sort of ensure quality assurance and quality control? And what's the role of the regulator in determining and enforcing potentially some new quality assurance and quality control standards? Rob, can we start with you?
Sure, I'd be very interested to hear what the other speakers think of this, but this is something that's important to us. In keeping with that Cass Sunstein quote that we included, it shouldn't just be up to the customer to sort of let the buyer beware. A lot of times when you sign up for utility services, you sort of sign up in advance, and you can be stuck with them for a while, and unless you're monitoring them very closely, sometimes it's hard to know what you're getting. So I think that there needs to be some obligation that's beyond just the consumer there. And I think different states will probably approach this in different ways. Sometimes Attorney General's offices, even beyond sort of the typical utility folks, in sort of standard kind of consumer protections. But I think that where you're talking about things that are associated with a kind of a basic service like utilities. I mean, I know we're talking about value-added services, but there needs to be, I think, some kind of involvement by utility regulators to make sure that customers are getting what's promised and that they're not being taken advantage of. So I'd be interested to hear if the other speakers have particular ideas also.
Sure. Let's turn to Jonathan and then Ryan. Quickly, because I'd like to get one more question in.
Sure. Yeah, so I think there are two sides to this question, right? There's what the customer expects and there's what the utility as the grid operator expects, right? So certainly if a customer is signing up for rooftop solar, they need to understand what exactly they're getting and what the expectation of that system is for performance, and also what their economic benefit is, who is operating that system and when. I think if that system is being net metered and a third party has control over it, they may curtail. Customer may be sort of stunned by their economic curtailment of that value. So I think there needs to be very clear sort of explanation of that up front. But on the other side, if a utility is contracting with a third party or a consumer for capacity or energy from a particular resource, that resource needs to be there when needed. And if it's not, there needs to be consequences to its non-performance. And we don't really see that today. But as we create a system that's more reliant on distributed energy resources and to a degree value-added services for critical grid needs, there needs to be certain reliability expectations, let's say, going the other way as well.
Any other quick thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, real quick. Jonathan touches on a really interesting aspect of it that we haven't really had a chance to get into, which is the flow of services from customers and third parties up to utilities, as we find sort of new and different ways for the utility to meet its obligations. And I would agree there that absolutely you need to have you have contractual obligations between whoever's providing that service, whether it's a large industrial or it's a third party aggregating lots of small distributed resources of various kinds. So there's clearly a contractual arrangement there. The utility has to be able to rely on those resources to meet its needs. On the other side, I touched upon this just a little bit. As I mentioned, consumers definitely need to have confidence in the market, and they need to know that it should not be buyer beware. We do see a role for regulators, but we want to make sure that role is appropriate and that that if they're putting additional oversight requirements in place or reporting requirements or standard disclosures, whatever it might be, that those work to enhance that confidence in the market and to address any specific concerns. New York State actually just released a set of uniform business practices for distributed energy resource suppliers. I think it's about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the order that they issued took at the end took a much lighter touch than their original proposal. So the original proposal was quite broad in scope.
Why don't we leave it there, because
sure.
I was trying to get a quick response, and it's a good reference for people. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here and get. I'm going to start with Rob and then see if folks can really provide a couple concise responses. So the question is really, look, if we now have third parties pretty strongly competing with the regulated utility for the same kind of services to some extent, how do you maintain a free and fair system? And the analogy that's been provided is, transportation lines that are managed by the ISO or RTO for anyone's wheel power through. Rob, let's start with you.
Well, I think that's hard to do. I think of the example of the efforts to deregulate the telephone industry back around the turn of the century, which makes it sound like a long time ago. I guess it was, but it's hard to acknowledge the problems that you have. I mean, incumbent utilities do have certain advantages. Their customers know them. They've got access to data. They've got, sort of the potential to have kind of affiliate relationships that, you can. It's hard to make sure that there's not leaning going on back and forth there. But by the same token, third-party affiliates can have some of their own advantages too. They're very different kinds of organizations. I think if you can work all that out, you can have competition. But there's certainly skepticism and differences of opinions amongst our membership about whether you can work it at all.
All right, Ryan and Jonathan, quickly on that point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm not sure we'll get to all of it. But I think at the end of the day, you want. I think if we have roles that are fairly well defined between utilities and third parties, and have them working as much as possible in collaboration, that's really the desired end state here. And if you can do that, it's going to be an evolution. It's going to take time, but I think if you can do that, then that's going to be the best outcome for the customer.
Last
Sure.
Jonathan?
Yep. Just to throw my 2 cents in, I really do think that while there are business model implications there, it really comes down to pricing. It's really about how we're pricing a more efficient and optimized system, and what are the price signals we're sending to incent new and advanced energy technologies, which is essentially energy technologies and services, which is essentially what we're talking about, these value-added services. So today our system is not priced to do that. So we need to really rethink how we are pricing the grid and pricing electricity, and how transparent we are about those price signals and what signals we're sending to customers. If we can sort of become more transparent about what those prices are trying to do, I think we can build a more efficient and equitable system.
Thanks very much, all of you. Thanks to Jonathan Blansfield, Ryan Katowski, and Rob Mork. And thanks to all of you for listening. Our next report is on transportation electrification, so look for a report and webinar in spring. Have a good day. Thank you.